Whenever you start a new project, everything feels like a mess. Everything is hard. Even the parts that felt immediately clear in your head get less clear once you try to get them out. It's a mess. And because it's a mess, we get sold a lie. Maybe it's just a misconception, but I'm pretty sure people out there try to convince us there are secrets that don't exist. The lie, or the misconception, is that if you only had the right process for how to do this thing, then suddenly it's going to feel clean and linear, like you can move straight from the idea to the thing. We try so hard to figure out what process we need. We try so hard to make the work simple and smooth because we're trying so hard to remove the mess. But what if you can't? When you create a lot of stuff, that is the question you're left with. I've made stuff for years, almost 20 of them. Blog posts, podcasts, newsletters, videos, books, speeches, docuseries, slideshows and community groups, and random scripts and drafts for things that went absolutely nowhere, and then random scripts and drafts that led to huge projects for big brands and tiny startups. And I've made basically anything you can put out on the internet, except NFTs. I just want to go on record. Anyway, when you create a ton of work, you realize there's no skipping the mess. It's part of it. You make a mess, you clean it up. You try something, then see how it feels. You use your taste to figure out what to keep, what to adjust, and what to kill. It's always trial and error. With more experience, I've just become more sure of this. You can't remove the mess. In fact, you wouldn't want it to go away. It's actually crucial to the creative process, which is good because, again, there's no way to remove it at all, even with more experience or more confidence. Really, you just get better at directing the mess, and you enjoy the mess more. And that leads to better work. I want this series to do two things. First, I want to try my best to showcase or at least explain my mess, which still happens to me every time, even after the body of work that I've built. And second, I want to push you to stop trying to replace your mess and instead to move through it with more confidence and even more joy. This is a behind-the-scenes series about developing my show, How Stories Happen. As I move through each phase of this project's development, I'll share the things I'm doing to direct the mess, because I know now I can't remove it. I can guide it, I can coax out my best, I can push and prompt and add and subtract and try this and try that, but I can't escape the mess. But more than showcase my mess, I want this to help you direct yours, to guide it and move through it with confidence and maybe even a smile, because it's the mess that brings out your best. Let's make a mess. So I think there's this assumption when you make a lot of stuff that there's some kind of hidden secret for how to just make this run smoother when you create things. I've made a lot of stuff in my career at this point, and I'm grateful that some people in some places in pockets of this world think maybe some of my stuff isn't totally terrible. And so now there's people approaching me thinking hey, you have a secret, you have a simple solution to this problem, and I don't.
All right, just a brief confessional here. I'm sitting in the parking lot of my son's daycare. It is 8:50 in the morning, and I'm doing two things. I'm debating postponing my dentist appointment because I have so many things to get done to prep this show. Shouldn't do that. Probably take care of myself first before a project that doesn't exist yet. And then the second thing is I've been the whole drive debating, how do I introduce this? What goes on in the episode? Are you makers? Are you marketers? Are you content creators? Are you entrepreneurs, experts, authors, speakers? I get so held up on these details. It's at the end of the day, I'm in my head, it at once matters a ton or it doesn't matter at all. I don't know, but I've spent the whole car ride thinking about this. No matter how many times I do it, I get stuck on stuff like this.
And here's the thing, when I started, even when I was a few years into making stuff, I also thought there was some version of me in the future that once I got there, I could stop feeling the pain of going through this messy portion of the work, and I would have some kind of process, technique, system, something to make it easy, some secret sauce. And now that I'm here, I'm cool, I'm here now. I don't have that yet.
Later in the day now, it's 10:40 in the morning. I went to my dentist appointment, so good job me for prioritizing my physical well-being over making a new podcast. What a breakthrough. It was a battle, so thank you. But like, I was sitting in the chair and I was just thinking about the show.
So the reality is a lot easier to say, but harder to embrace maybe, which is that this work is always trial and error. So if someone asks me, or if I ask someone else, like how to do this, or how to make it easier, or what if this, or should I do this? The real answer is like, I don't know, try something. How did it feel? It's always trial and error.
All right, so I finally got the newsletter out, and I wrote it as an essay. I wrote about the difference between Story 1.0 and Story 2.0. Some things happen just in my head, just by writing it. And then some things are happening like in my inbox because people are responding. Like this person is saying like, oh, I'd heard this story several times. I thought it was lore. But to your point, the way you shared it, Jay, was personal to you and your perspective, and that makes a difference. That seems to be Story 2.0. That's interesting, right? The difference between 1.0 and 2.0 is learning story or being a storyteller. That's a phrase that I used when writing the essay. This person is pointing out that I did that. That's kind of cool. Okay, this person is saying the difference between Story 1.0 and Story 2.0 is like in how boomers deal with TikTok. Older generations are used to lots of setup. Welcome to the space. Younger generations, like, you gotta hook them real quick first. That's not what I'm going for. The thing that actually worked was trying to figure out how, like, Story 1.0 is about learning story. Story 2.0 is about all the things that come from the storyteller. If you learn the story structure, and we both knew it, and you had the same little fact sheet of what the story was about, you and I would tell the story differently. Why? How? What's that coming from? That's Story 2.0. It's, yeah, the process matters. That's 1.0, but it's also the posture, like your ability to see and what you see. And then your practice, the routine of actually shipping and creating things and figuring out yourself as much as your craft, as much as the work.
And there's like two waves of mess you're moving through at all times. There's the internal mess, which nobody talks about because it doesn't look like content. And then there's the stuff that happens after that internal debate and agony and back and forth in your head and your heart, which is like putting your butt in the chair and doing the work and then using your taste to understand, is this what I wanted? And the answer is almost invariably, not yet, but I'm gonna keep going anyway.
All right, so the thing is finally published. And in truth, I wrote about something that has been like circulated a lot. It's this clip of the artist Pharrell visiting Maggie Rogers, another artist, another singer-songwriter, when she was in school. A lot of people know about this moment where an established artist was impressed by a budding artist, and they've seen this clip on YouTube. But I went with it because it's just like, I don't know how to make sense of it. I just know that like what Pharrell and Maggie are going through is emblematic of what I want more of us to start from a place of like, that's Story 2.0. I don't know. Like, it's just, that was in front of my face, so I ran with it.
The actual hard truth that we have to embrace is rather than gather up all of our answers to justify creating, we have to create to find our answers. It's in the act of making something that we figure out what the heck it is we were trying to make.
I've been at this for 2 hours. I'm trying to like just figure out what concept I'm writing about right now, because I can sense that there's like Story 1.0 is how we learn story in business for many years. Story 2.0 is like, I think this is something we need to try. I don't know what the two things are. I just sense that the current approach is broken. What is the second thing? What am I trying to say? I can't even say it here. So I'm just gonna try to write and post about it until something gets clear.
So there's this really popular idea, which I ascribe to, which is you should create the things that follow you around. The ideas that chase you everywhere, the ones you can't shake are the ones that are worth pursuing. And I get it and I love it. But here's the problem. While you're trying to just go for a walk or move about your life, all of these things start happening in your brain. Like for me, the first phase of it is daydreaming, and it's blissful. I'm like imagining what the first version of something could be, or I'm listening to something or thinking of something that I like from other people, and I'm trying to like graft elements of that onto what I could do. Like, oh yeah, it'd be cool if. But then you go, wait a sec, I gotta place this into the context of my life and my business, and I have to earn a living, and what do I have to kill in order to do this project? And then if you can make those decisions in your head, which good luck, you then go back to the project, or at least I do, and I start thinking about all these hidden elements. Sometimes they're really technical, like where do I find a design resource or my music, or where do I find the time in my schedule? And then sometimes they're less technical and calculating, and they're much more existential, like maker monsters start to grip you. You know, okay, well, if I explain it like this, is that only going to appeal to me? Or wait a sec, I believe in doing the things that light you up and then finding people who care about it too. And you start to go all down, like down this rabbit hole that just leaves you in a place where it's like agony because you're just overthinking something or thinking too much about whether or not you can do it, because the idea is chasing you everywhere. And finally, eventually you have to get to the point where you just say, fine, I'll make you.
I can't be alone in working on the parts of a project that aren't actually the most important parts first. Like, I've been agonizing over, what the heck do I name this show? When I like barely know what the show is really about. I don't have the premise. Okay, today's really about premise development, not naming the show. I get distracted. Premise development to me is about trying to figure out your perspective first and then turn that into positioning. So it's really positioning as perspective. Can you take what would be discovered with time spent with you and make that readily apparent? And the way I try to do that is through a lot of steps, because luckily I've developed shows before, but the crown jewel of premise development is the empathy statement, and that's what I'm working on today. The thing I'm most thankful for at this point in my work is this is the starter dough copy. I can dip into it whenever I want to create pretty much anything involving the show, from the tiny little things like how I introduce the premise every episode, to the larger things like how I explain the show everywhere I go, and how I inform the formatting of the episode, how I inform the marketing, all of it. So I'm not set. This is going to be iterative, but I have at least a line of sight towards what this show could be.
So once I started down the path of making the show, the biggest shift in when I was earlier in my career and now is I recognize that there's this whole thing that you can do called premise development, or really it's about identifying what your perspective is and turning that into positioning. So you have these rough but relevant concepts, ideas, beliefs, maybe things you just sense. You have to put language to that so that when people actually arrive to whatever the project becomes, they instantly feel and know this is for me. And that is the power of developing your premise.
It's late. I've been at it for a while, trying to develop the empathy statement, which is the copy that you write to describe your premise, the empathy statement it's called. By the way, this is water. So it's just water. Sorry, spicy water. There's too much writing here. It's close, but it's not there yet. I still haven't gotten to story yet. I'm still in the setup period of these paragraphs. I need to get quicker to like what it is I'm trying to help people with and say on the show, but it's looming into view, this idea of the premise here as I try to write my way there. So I like where this part's going. As Ira Glass said, great stories happen to those who can tell them. He doesn't mean worthy things only appear to people already versed in the craft of storytelling. He means it is a craft. And so if we want to understand it, we need to understand the crafting, not just the theory of it all. It's okay, it's a little messy. And here's a line I really like. Storytellers don't experience extraordinary things. They know how to imbue meaning into ordinary things. That's not bad. That's how stories happen. But that's rarely put on display, and on the show, I think we want to put that on display. So it's getting close.
You're like an author, asking big questions and then investigating. But then as you go, okay, I think this is actually worth turning into a project, you shift modes into being more like a comedian, where you're going to put out content and kind of say to the world, is this anything?
Okay, so like here's me bringing out into the light the small comedy club for working out material that is social media. I'm gonna bring out private thoughts and writing publicly to test them out. How do we find great stories? And I talk about a metaphor of like somebody flagging us down to say, here's the story. But how do stories really happen? As Ira Glass said, great stories happen to those who can tell them. Isn't that just so ironic that the only things worth sharing are found by the people who know how to share them? And of course, that's not what he's saying. He's saying storytellers don't experience anything extraordinary. Instead, they know how to imbue meaning into things that are ordinary. And so I'll put out all these posts that kind of explain what I'm thinking about or how I feel, finding the right language to ensure it resonates, and then I'm looking for a small number of people reacting in big ways to validate the idea. And so I go, oh, okay, this premise might be powerful enough to support a whole show, given the response I'm seeing and the way I can now articulate it to ensure that people care.
So I do a lot of writing. It's really just from an area of frustration or curiosity. There's not much form and function to it. I'm just sensing my way forward. It's a mess. And I put down these stakes in the ground and I stand for this, and I can't stand that this is how we think of storytelling.
Okay, this is a social media post, a LinkedIn post I put out to test my ideas around what is the enemy that we're attacking? What's the problem the show is here to solve? And how can I articulate it to rally some true believers around the show? And, it's really focused on mediocrity at scale. It's never been easier for people to be mediocre at scale. And that's not the goal. The goal is to get off the hamster wheel and create more valuable, more original work. Because when you matter more, you can beg for attention less. That's what the show is about. And do people see it that way? And can I articulate it using key phrases like this to ensure that people care, not just about this post, but about the premise of the whole show?
The way we learn story in business is broken. So you go through this period of moving from observations and frustrations to steadily getting your idea tighter and ready for prime time as you make an assertion about what should be. This is what storytelling should be understood to be. So obviously I've been talking a lot about this idea of the mess, and you can't replace the mess and you have to move through it confidently. So good news and bad news. The good news is everybody deals with the mess. The bad news is there's actually two messes. The first is this really open-ended, wandering in the wilderness, out on a walk or driving your car or sitting around your house, and it's all internal. That's where the first mess takes place. And it's sort of the content people talk about is just the tip of the iceberg, but underneath is everything you went through in your head and your heart, right? You thought things and felt things, and it's super messy. And I like to make sure that stuff comes out and becomes content quicker, because it really helps me pressure test whether or not I want to pursue something, but also whether or not it's something that could hold water, where people can actually understand what it's about and care about it in their context, because it's different. What's in my head is just the idea. How do I get that idea out into the world? Well, I could just decide, great, it feels good to me, now it's a whole show. But what I need to do is start putting little bobs in the water and see if I get any tugs, right? So that's like the internal mess. It's all the stuff that people have no technique for, and they don't talk about, and we can't access from other people. And then you go, yeah, I think I'm gonna make something now. And then it's much more of a focused mess, because you've picked your direction. And now every time you show up, you're like, all right, I'm making a show. How do I document the premise? Is there any structure to that? How have I said it in the past that caused people to go, oh, that's a thing? What's the format of the episode? So you go from an open-ended internal mess that feels pretty unbounded, like there's not many guardrails around you, to now you put up some guardrails and you start to make a mess in a focused way.
Okay, tons of work. Lots of public aeration of my ideas through my content have landed me here with the actual explanation of the premise, otherwise known as an empathy statement, which comes in 4 parts. First, I want to align with people. Then I want to agitate the problems and challenges that they feel and that they want solved. Then I want to assert my perspective. This is my assertion, aka my premise, and then invite them to the show. So here are those 4 pieces all in a row. You are an expert, an entrepreneur, a content creator, or a communicator. You want your work to resonate. To do that, you're trying to learn story. But the problem with learning story is it's externalized to you. It's a checklist, the process. But that's not the entire thing. Having the process isn't enough for you to then apply that process and make things that matter, because the process is just one part of mastery of craft. There's also the posture, how you see yourself and the world, the messy bag of humanity that you bring with you to everything you do. Some people don't use it. Some people use it once in a while. Others use it confidently and consistently. We want to be there. In addition to the posture, there's also the practice, your routine of creating something on a deadline purely to persist and improve. In the practice, you might find a process more tailored to you rather than someone else. And yeah, if you get stuck, there's all the advice out there. But the problem is, all we get from others is that advice. All we get is their process. We never really put on display their practice or posture, so we never really get a window into their full mastery of craft. That's the problem. The way we learn today is focused on learning story. Call that Story 1.0. And that got us here. But today's world demands Story 2.0. It's not about learning story. It's about being storytellers. And there's a very big difference. So what can we do to become masters? We should be learning this stuff in the minutia, in the hidden choices of making a thing, because this is a craft. As Ira Glass says,
great stories happen to those who can tell them. He's not saying meaningful things only happen to people who are already masters of the craft. He's saying it is a craft. You don't experience stories, you experience life. Then you turn that into stories. Because great storytellers don't need to experience anything extraordinary. They know how to imbue meaning into things that are ordinary. On How Stories Happen, we're putting this creative craft on display so we can see all three parts of mastery unfolding: their process, their practice, and their posture. Every episode, a business storyteller will dissect one signature story or draft. We'll talk about how they found it, how they developed it, and how it might improve, as well as how they're using it to build their business and leave their legacy. Great stories happen to those who can tell them. It's a craft. We're putting the craft front and center on this show because that is how stories happen.
So I know the first hurdle, and really 90% of the whole work to make a show work is to develop the premise, and to do that with public content and conversation. I have some structure to it. How do you explain an idea? Well, first I have to align with you. You're an expert, an entrepreneur, a content creator of some kind, and you want your work to resonate with other people. And so to do that, you're trying to learn story, right? And that's just aligning with you. Yep, I'm going through that. But then I need to agitate some of the frustration you have. So from alignment, you move to agitation. Well, here's the problem with learning story, almost like you're learning Instagram ads or learning how to use a camera. It's not an externalization. That's about the process, right? The process is just one part of mastery when it comes to being an effective storyteller. There's also the posture, like I see the world a certain way and myself in it. And there's also the practice. So can you put your butt in the seat and ship every week on deadline? The train is leaving Wednesdays at 8 a.m. You're gonna be on the train. It's the same with creative work, right? The whole Ira Glass idea of you have to ship a lot of work to get through the gap. So can you actually master the craft of storytelling? Well, right now we're all looking for a process out there. If you turn inward, you do the work only you can do. That requires posture and practice. Great. I'm now going to agitate this pain. We don't understand this correctly, and here's a bunch of symptoms of like what you go through, and your work's not resonating as a result. Yeah, because you're not seeing what storytelling really has to be. As Ira Glass also says, great stories happen to those who can tell them. Meaning, you experience life, not stories, and you turn that into stories. It's a created act. You have to master the craft. You don't have to experience anything extraordinary when you know how to imbue meaning into things that are ordinary. Okay, great, I've now aligned with you, agitated some of the frustrations, the understandings you currently have, the problems. Now I'm gonna make my assertion. That was the third part, that this happens in the minutia. We have to dissect one signature story from our guests to really see all three parts of mastery unfolding. It can't be retroactive advice from 30,000 feet from these guests, and it can't be some like tips and tricks or structure for how to tell stories, because it's the difference between you learning story and actually being a storyteller. That's what we're going for on the show. So align, agitate, and assert. I'm making an assertion. I have my premise. Now I'm going to invite you, in this case, to the show or to the ongoing journey that I have across my platform to transform smart experts into more influential communicators and storytellers, right? So now I have that. And there's this giant remaining question, which is, well, that feels good, and that can inform a lot of different projects. It's going to inform the show. And so how do I use the premise, again, like a comedian would, from the premise everything else follows? How do I use the premise to inform the actual content? How do I go from the idea I want the show and therefore myself to be known for to actually structuring each episode?
That's the thing about making what matters. You can't actually remove the mess. Developing your ideas, developing a project's premise, it's gonna be messy, but you wouldn't want to skip the mess because it's the mess that brings out your best. Next time, we take our mess into the actual construction of an episode of the show. How do you get people to the end? How do you use the premise to structure a great episode? Keep making what matters to you and keep making a mess. See you next time.